Hey there, students. Tom Richey here with the Bill of Rights Institute, here for a bit of A-Push review. All right, we've got the AP US History exam coming up in a month and a day. So we've got our series that's ongoing, and in these prep webinars, we are typically taking something in particular and taking a look at it, and a lot of times going into something skill-based. Okay, so what I want to do here, and this is something that often comes up in A-Push courses, is getting into the causes of the Civil War. Now, the Civil War can be something of what a friend of mine once called a nuance-resistant topic. Okay, that really the causes of the Civil War in pop culture, tends to be something that people tend to argue about rather than to explore. Okay, so what I want to do here is I want to go ahead and and get into the causes of the Civil War and looking at each of them and thinking about how we would go about gathering evidence. Okay, so we've got a few of y'all here. It looks like Addie's here. Looks like James is here. Thank y'all very much. Now, any kinds of questions that y'all got about the Civil War, y'all just go ahead and put those to me. And I'm going to go ahead. I've got a link to the Google Doc. I've got a Google Doc open where I'm going to make notes as I'm going over this. Let's look at this as kind of a tutoring session, a Q&A, and really thinking about how would we make causation-based arguments when we're thinking about the coming of the Civil War and the causes. So with that, if we were to take, I was born in the United States, so I've never had to take this test, but once I helped somebody prepare for the U.S. citizenship test, okay? And when you take the U.S. citizenship test, there is a section, which, gosh, a lot of American citizens probably couldn't pass this test, but there is a section on here that is devoted to U.S. history. And one of the things here that, that it asks is about the causes of the Civil War. Can you identify one of those causes? And so I'm going to go in here and I'm going to use that same framework that we see on the U.S. citizenship test in exploring the causes of the Civil War. Now, we can also look at some others, okay? But when we're thinking about making a causation-based argument, okay, and again, this Google Doc that I'm working on, this is linked in the description. And now, while you're looking under the video, if you are not yet subscribed to the Bill of Rights Institute's YouTube channel, make sure that you do that so you can not only get these review webinars, but also the Bright and Early series, okay? So make sure they've got a lot of great content coming up on YouTube. So when we get into causes of the Civil War, we're going to get into, when we think about, again, this is coming from not me, but the U.S. citizenship test. We're thinking about, and this is in no particular order, so let me actually make a bulleted list here because I think that you should always be able to make a free inquiry there. Of course, slavery is the cause that gets the most attention nowadays. Certainly when you're looking at a textbook, if you're looking at what academic historians are writing, slavery gets more attention than other causes that are often mentioned as well. So slavery and what we might call states, what people call states' rights versus federal authority. States' rights by itself is a bit nebulous, okay? So versus federal authority. And then we would look at also sectional economic differences, okay? So especially at the turn of the 20th century, that was something that was very popular, looking at this. Now, one thing that we would want to note is when you look at these three causes, we see here that slavery would be a social cause, okay? So if you look at history as being driven by social factors, you would be most likely to think about slavery being this, this overlying, the main cause here. Now, states' rights versus federal authority, this would be a political cause, and then sectional economic differences would, of course, be economic. So you've got a political, an economic, and a social explanation for this. And once in a while, I'm going to make sure to check on the chat and see what y'all are saying, see what y'all are offering here, okay? So Now, the thing is, one thing, now we don't have an LEQ this year, but at the same time, we could get a DBQ that is very similar. Now, I don't know if they'll go straight from an LEQ a couple years ago to, or maybe, yeah, there was an LEQ last year on the cause of the Civil War. But if we were to think about, this is one thing I've seen on DBQ prompts before for APUSH. So a possible prompt, okay? A possible prompt could read something like, evaluate the relative importance, okay? The relative importance of various let's see, let's just run back to the, let's see, 2018 APUSH free response, okay? Just got to pull that up real quick. And that's something, of course, you could pull up on your machine, but I'm not going to show it on the screen because this belongs to the College Board. But as far as that, yeah, the relative importance of different causes, okay? So the relative importance of different causes for the American Civil War, okay? So that would be a possible prompt. Evaluate the relative importance of different causes for the American Civil War. And I want to think in terms of what documentary evidence would we see here, okay? So when we think about this, we would think in terms of, we would say here, in the period from, okay? So I would say here, in the period from 1820 to I would say maybe 1865, because what we want to think about in terms of, sometimes you can see the Civil War, you can see the cause of something through the effects, okay? And so with that, like for example, if this were going to be a, a DBQ or an LEQ, if I were going to use my LEQ setup, what I would say here, like, let's say that you're thinking about, you're thinking about slavery versus states' rights, okay? And we've got to think about what kind of evidence would we use to support that. So I'm going to put in this box, evidence, and then in this box, effects, okay? Because one thing that you might want to do in terms of, thinking about causation is analyzing the cause of something from the effect. And so one thing, when I'm teaching about the Civil War, I think one of the most important things is to get out of this either or argument. And when you're thinking about complex understanding, one of the biggest things here, now, of course, this is something that the complex understanding point is going to be very difficult for most students to earn, even more difficult this year, given that it's one of 10 points and you've only got 45 minutes. So with that, when we think about the evidence here and then the effects. Now, if we think about this, what would be, go ahead, I want to see in the chat, what I want to see y'all do in the chat is to give me pieces of evidence and attach a cause to it, okay? So, excuse me, in the chat, I want to see a piece of evidence, if you want to, and then just put in parentheses, slavery, a piece of evidence that you would use to back up the states' rights argument, or a piece of evidence for economic differences or sectionalism, okay? So that's what I want to see when I go into the chat. I want y'all to go ahead and put into the chat some evidence that you would use to support arguments for these different causes. And actually, I think I thought I was screen sharing, but I wasn't, okay. Yeah, so here's the thing, that when you look at, Lincoln getting elected without a Southern vote, now that would be something, and that's where, you could also, now let me go into here, Addie. I think this is great because we're not restricted to these three causes, anything that you can back up, okay? So we would say here is that we would have, what we would see here is political polarization, okay? So political polarization, and the failure of the second two-party system, okay? Because when we think about this, when we think about political polarization, what we're thinking about, this is a term that we use in AP government to describe when politics, like right now, we're very, very polarized. So let's think about this now. 9/11 is not going to be on the exam this year, but I don't know, maybe, yeah, Haley, you might, Haley, who's running this broadcast behind the scenes, should be old enough to remember 9/11, or at least been alive. Now, for those of you about to take the exam, you are, you don't remember 9/11 or what happened here, okay? So the thing is that what I've noticed about this coronavirus crisis, okay, we are at a time of high polarization, okay, high polarization. And so, given that we're at a point of high polarization, the coronavirus crisis has not put an end to politics. Like, when we think about this, people are just as ugly, not on both sides, okay? And that's one thing. Y'all have got tonight, if you want to turn in an essay for the Bill of Rights We the Students essay contest, which Bill of Rights can put a link either in the chat or in the description. But the Bill of Rights Institute, this We the Students essay contest, which has a ton of money that they're giving away, by the way, that it's about civil discourse. What does civil discourse mean to you? And so right now with the corona crisis, there's still all of this back and forth. Now, and I'm not passing judgment either way, but people are not rallying around, like saying, let's have unity here. You see a lot of people going back and forth, the blame game. Politics really ugly right now. Now, if we go back to 9/11, political polarization was not as much of a thing, which meaning that there was less of a difference between most Democrats and Republicans in 2001 than there is in 2020. Okay, so it's like basically in 2020, like saying that you're a Democrat or a Republican, or whether or not you support President Trump, that can be today grounds for like somebody either wanting to be your friend or not wanting to be your friend. Whereas 2001, not so much. Now, after 9/11, there was this rally around the flag effect, rally around the president. One of the things people your age may not understand, why, when the Iraq war was so, looking back, the Iraq war is so unpopular. It's like leaders of, President Trump and leaders of the Democratic Party, they say that was a mistake. Well, why is it that at the time, people went into the Iraq war so willingly, like that the Congress like gave President Bush carte blanche, not much different than the Gulf of Tonkin resolution for the Vietnam War, which also won't be on the exam. But when you think about this, the Bush administration got to go into Iraq because of the unity that we saw because of 9/11. Basically, George W. Bush's approval rating shot up and people thought, I trust the president. Okay. Now, right now, I think that there is a lot of distrust. So what you could think about here is political polarization. You could definitely use that as a cause. Now, you don't have to go into a set framework, anything that you can back up with evidence. So if we think about this, what we would do in terms of, and I'm going to go, take a look at what y'all are putting down as far as some causes. But if I wanted to look at political polarization, okay, so we would say, what we would say here is to go with that, we would say the demise of the Whig Party, okay? So and then the Republican Party, okay? So the founding of the Republican Party, which was sectional, okay? So you have, for the first time, one of the major parties is a sectional party. Now, the two-party system, what it does, when you look at like Democrats and Republicans today, that it is certainly, we can see regional alliances, right? So if we're thinking about this, if we look at the 2016 presidential election map, so we can see when we take a look at this presidential election map, we can see that certainly there are regions that are friendlier to the Republican Party, regions that are friendlier to the Democratic Party. Like, for example, the Democratic Party is much more popular in, the Northeast, the West Coast. Those are the strongholds there. And then you see here that there are some states here and there. Now, then you can see that the Republicans are more popular in the South, a lot of the mountain states and the Midwest. But then again, some of these states that are in red, and even a few of them that are in blue, like if you think about Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, New Mexico, Colorado, these are states where a two-party, Nevada, these are states where a two-party system still exists. So you have a national system. Okay, so both parties today are multi-regional. It's not that you would say the Republican Party has its stronghold in the South, whereas the Democratic Party has its stronghold in the North. It's definitely, you can see here that, it is, both parties are national parties. So I think that that's something that you could definitely get into. One thing that I often mention is, and I think this is very relevant, is 8 of the first 12 presidents. Okay, so if you think about this, 8 of the first 12 presidents were from the South. 4 of the first 5 presidents were from the South. So when you think about, basically the South sees this loss of political power, that can be an argument that you could make here, okay? And so you see that Lincoln, basically the election of Abraham Lincoln, okay? And certainly it wasn't a surprise when the political class in the southern states found that to be unacceptable. But as far as that goes, that's certainly something that you could make as an argument. Now, on the development of the U.S., okay, and that's another thing here, yes, that you could see here, that I would say, I've talked about before, when we think about the rise of democracy, okay? So when we think about the rise of democracy, this is something that was a destabilizing factor. So you certainly could get into that when you think about that the first two-party system was not really grounded as much in democracy as the second two-party system. So that could be something. Yeah, the thing is, as long as you can make a logical argument here. So, when we look at this, the Whig Party, now what we would say, James, about the Whig Party is that the Whig Party was a national party. It was, when you're thinking about polarization, that the Whigs and the Democrats in the second two-party system, they were different. There were policy differences, but whether you were a Democrat or a Whig, it didn't matter quite as much as in the late 1850s if you were a Democrat or a Republican, especially a Southern Democrat or a Republican, when we've got some things like, for example, Dred Scott. Now, let's see what we've got here on the, so you could see some things like, urbanization. That could be, that could be an interesting argument here. So here's the thing, James. I think that you've gotten on to something here. Okay, so when we look at this, okay, I've got something here. When South Carolina threatened to, let's see, so nullification. You might be thinking about nullification. Addie, let's see here. So let me just kind of, oh yes, okay. So Molly, this is a great one here, okay? Because another thing that you could use here is certainly manifest destiny and westward expansion, okay? That's something that, and that's something that could be really, it can be intertwined with the slavery issue, okay? Because westward expansion, so if we were going to make a westward expansion argument, you look at things such as free soil parties, okay? So free soil parties, and remember that slavery, slavery in the South, so in the South, not seen as a problem, okay? So when we think about free soil parties, slavery in the South not seen as a problem, but slavery in the West, okay? So when we get there, we think about, debates over slavery in the West, okay? So that's, of course, you would get into the Compromise of 1850, the Kansas-Nebraska Act, bleeding Kansas. So now what you see here is that the slavery issue is definitely going to enter into this westward expansion argument, but the way that you're making this argument is going to be more oriented toward it's not so much the slavery issue in the abstract, but it's more in this debate over slavery in the territories. Okay, so everything here, when you think about Dred Scott, and Dred Scott is about basically like, look, the Supreme Court says that Congress cannot limit slavery in the territories. Okay, so as far as that goes, that's what we're looking at with this. And so westward expansion is definitely something that we could get into. Now, of course, the slavery argument is so strong because a lot of the most controversial things that happened during this time were things that happened due to slavery. Okay, now another thing here, we might even note the Wilmot Proviso. Okay, so slavery, we can get in, of course, abolitionism, and then anytime we're bringing up abolitionism, yeah, just ISM. Okay, and we could think about William Lloyd Garrison, and Frederick Douglass. You want to make sure that you're getting as specific as possible when you get into that, right? And so abolitionism, of course, coming from abolitionism, this is something where you get the Southern defense of slavery. Okay, so you get the Southern defense of slavery as personified by, as demonstrated by Calhoun and others. Okay, so who basically, this is what we call the positive defense of slavery. Now, this is something that I typically say, now I think this is probably true for people in general, but I think it's especially true for Southerners. And I say this as a Southerner myself. Okay, so when you think about Thomas Jefferson, okay, when you think about Thomas Jefferson and we think about like the Missouri Compromise, okay, so when we think about contextualization, somebody was asking about contextualization, I'd probably go into the Missouri Compromise, because the Missouri Compromise can go, a number of ways. Okay, now you could even go as far back as the Constitution. You could go as far back into the Constitution and go into like the 3/5 compromise in the Constitution. Okay, so the Constitutional Convention, you can even reach back there and see, what you would have there. Now, also possibly like the Northwest Ordinance, especially if you were getting into westward expansion, you could get into any of these things here for contextualization. And so you would see, the positive defense of slavery. We would see the abolitionist movement spreading. We could see the founding of the Republican Party, right? Of the Republican Party. And then we see things about, debates over the expansion of slavery into the West. Okay, which of course kind of goes here, see westward expansion. So the thing is, what we want to note about the slavery argument, it's not just the existence of slavery, the abstract existence of slavery, it is the debates over the status of slavery, and that's where that westward expansion kind of goes into this. And that would be a great way to make this into a complex argument, because these two are so intertwined. Okay, so then as we go here, let me go ahead and check on the chat here and see what we're seeing there. All right, and let's see the let's see the audio. Are we seeing something about let's see, about half? Okay, the video. Okay, so hopefully everything's good. Hopefully everything's good at this point. Let me just listen to that real quick. What we're seeing there. All right, and let's see Okay, it looks like the audio and video are synced again. Okay, so as far as that goes, looks like the audio and video synced again. Okay, so James, you saw I was going to type the Northwest Ordinance. Okay, so I'm breaking the laws of time here. Now, somebody's noting, okay, so James, you noted something about the secession crisis. Okay, so when we think about this, that now let's go on to the states' rights debate. Okay, so I think that the lag thing's good. Let me go ahead. I've checked on the chat a little bit. Let me just make one more little look here, make sure we're good. Okay, James says he's having fun, so I think we're doing great. So with that, let's go ahead and look at the states' rights argument, which really gets a lot less attention in, it's certainly less sensational. Okay, there's a lot less there, it's a lot less sensational, and it doesn't go back as far. Okay, because the slavery argument, now one thing that we would note here is that slavery is really more of what we would call an underlying cause. Okay, if we think about, and this is where this gets really complex, and I enjoy talking about it once we get past where people are shouting at each other just trying to be right. Now, when we think about states' rights versus federal authority, this is something that is more of an immediate cause. Okay, so when we think about this as an immediate cause, what we're looking at here is the big question here. Okay, and when you look at why the Civil War started, okay, why people actually started shooting each other. Now, another thing we want to note on the slavery argument, one of the most cited things would be Deep South secession, okay, secession declarations. Okay, which most of the Deep South secession declarations explicitly mention slavery as a cause for secession. Now, when we get to the states' rights debate, okay, when we get to the states' rights versus federal authority debate, one of the things here that is key to understanding this is that secession, okay, so secession is not, is not Civil War. Okay, so that would be when somebody's making this argument that secession itself, from the Southern perspective, did not equal war. Okay, so when we think about like the perspective of the CSA, secession did not have to lead to war. Okay, that's one of the things here, that part of what you have to do for this is you separate secession from the actual beginning of the war itself. And so the big question, okay, the big question here that led to Fort Sumter, okay, so did the Southern states, okay, have the right to secede from the Union? Okay, so that's a big question. And remember that this does not appear, this is not addressed in the Constitution. Okay, so it is not specifically addressed in the Constitution. Now, the South would, Southern states would point to the 10th Amendment. They would say that, if you think about this in terms of the 10th Amendment, this is something that when you look at the 10th Amendment, it says whatever hasn't been given to the federal government or specifically denied to the states retain that power. So if the Constitution says that it doesn't say that a state can't secede, and it doesn't give the federal government the power to coerce a state, then the state has a right to secede. Now, here's another possible piece of contextualization. If you looked at the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions, okay, Jefferson and Madison in 1798, compact theory, because this is something that, when you look at the way that Jefferson and Madison viewed the Constitution as a compact between the states, okay, and so you think about this, that, this is the Constitution as compact, and that would be Jefferson Davis's Constitution. Thomas Jefferson and Jefferson Davis's Constitution, or as a national union, okay, Lincoln. And this is where the states' rights argument goes more into what's immediately leading to the Civil War. So when you think about this, you see the 10th Amendment. Now, of course, Lincoln sees this as a national union. So Fort Sumter, okay? Fort Sumter, where the Civil War started, all right? Fort Sumter, basically what happened here is that the Union tried to hold the fort and the Confederacy finally fired upon the Union garrison. So, so the Confederates, okay, so the Confederates saw the attack as defending sovereignty over the Charleston Harbor. So while Lincoln saw it as an act of rebellion. And what we do know about the Constitution is that the Constitution does give the federal government the authority to put down insurrections and rebellions. Okay, so when we look at that, Lincoln saw that as an act of rebellion. Now, then what you would do here is there are two waves of secession. There are the Deep South secessions that follow Lincoln's election, and then there are the Upper South secessions. Okay, so the Upper South secession declarations. And that would be Virginia, Tennessee, Arkansas, and North Carolina. So these are states that did not secede because of Lincoln's election, but once Lincoln called for troops, this is something, so in response to Lincoln's call for troops. So what you're seeing here is that these states, now while we want to note here that Deep South secession declarations mention slavery, okay, so specifically mentioned slavery in their, when we look at this, they specifically mention slavery in their reasons for seceding from the Union. Now, when we look at, the Upper South, it's more of a protest against Lincoln's call for troops, which they see as coercive, that Lincoln is trying to coerce states back into the Union. Now, a few final things that we would note here is that when we look at, when we look at the slavery argument, we have to think about point of view. The people who make the slavery argument is the primary cause. And remember, all of these have validity, okay? And so when you look at the slavery argument as the primary cause, a lot of it goes back to those Deep South secession declarations and the reasons for the Deep South seceding, the formation of the Confederate States of America. Also, another thing that's often mentioned here is Alexander H. Stephens' cornerstone speech. Okay, so cornerstone speech, which he said, now Alexander Stephens was the Confederate VP, who kind of ironically was against secession in the first place. So Stephens' cornerstone speech is another piece of evidence where he says that, this is, the racial hierarchy in the defense of slavery, that this is the cornerstone of the Confederacy. Okay, so that's something that slavery advocates, not people advocating slavery, people advocating slavery as a cause, slavery causation advocates, that's what they're bringing in here. Now, so going from there, when we look at Upper South secession declarations, now, instead of looking at what the people of the Deep South are saying and the formation of the Confederacy, what's going to happen now is looking at what is Lincoln saying? What is Congress saying? Okay, so when you look here, you're going to say that Lincoln, so before the Emancipation Proclamation, okay, so before the, as late as August of 1862, okay, as late as August of 1862, when the war began in 1861, Lincoln maintained, okay, that he was fighting a war only, okay, so he was fighting the war only to preserve the Union. Okay, that was basically his only thing. What we would note here is his open letter to Horace Greeley. Okay, I think that Greeley spelled with EY. Let's see. Yes, Horace Greeley. So Lincoln wrote, like, basically, Horace Greeley was an abolitionist newspaper editor in New York City. I believe the editor of the New York Tribune, if I'm not mistaken. And Horace Greeley had criticized Abraham Lincoln for not doing enough to ensure the freedom of the slaves. And Lincoln responded to him in an open letter. Now, if you ever see on a DDQ, open letter, an open letter is addressed to someone, it's addressed to an individual, but it's published so that everyone can see it. So the intended audience of an open letter is not necessarily just the person who it's to, it's really to the public. Okay, so Horace Greeley called Lincoln out, said, "You're not doing enough to free slaves." And Lincoln responded publicly. He said, "You know what? I'm not doing enough to free slaves because that's not why I'm fighting the war. I'm fighting the war to preserve the Union." Okay, so now another thing you would note, so Lincoln. Now also, I forget what this resolution was called. Let me note this: Resolution of Congress. Let me see if I can find this. I forget the name. Yes, this is the Crittenden-Johnson resolution. And this is basically, it was introduced as the War Aims resolution. Okay, so this is called, so the Crittenden-Johnson resolution. This was in July of 1861. So we would note here that we're looking at the point of view of the United States Congress. Okay, so we're looking at the Crittenden-Johnson resolution, July of 1861, and this is Congress. Okay, so Crittenden-Johnson, what we would call the War Aims resolution. Okay, so this War Aims resolution passed, and this is something that said that essentially this is saying that the war is not against slavery. Okay, so when it comes down to it, it doesn't mention slavery. Okay, so it basically says here that this is to defend and maintain the supremacy of the Constitution and to preserve the Union. Okay, so this is the United States Congress. Okay, and what we see here is that it said here, just going to paste there. Oh, oops. Okay, so that okay, I don't know what's going on there. Okay, let's see. I'm going to just refresh that page. Okay. So make sure I'm still broadcasting. Okay, looks like I am. Okay, so let's see. Okay, so let me get to some questions in just a second here, and I stopped sharing for a moment. So let me just go ahead and put this on here, and then we're going to get to some of these questions. So as far as that goes, the United States Congress said in July of 1861 that the purpose of the war was to defend and maintain the supremacy of the Constitution and preserve the Union. With no mention of slavery. So this is the thing, like when people say that the Civil War was about states' rights, they are saying that, that the evidence that they're looking at is much more, it's different evidence. And that's basically what historians do. What historians do every time somebody writes a book about the Civil War, any other topic, there's a mountain of evidence they can choose from. And so what they do is they use this evidence, they ignore this evidence, or they misrepresent or minimize other evidence to make their point. And so that's what you're doing as a historian here, okay? And so going into that, you've got, this is the argument here. Now, James is asking, is there a difference between the Deep South? Okay, so yeah, so when we think about this, and James, when you're asking about the Deep South versus the Upper South, then what we're saying that yes, that there are actually two waves of secession. So when somebody says like, all of the secession declarations, said something about slavery. Well, not exactly. That's really more true of the Deep South than the Upper South. So yeah, you want to understand there's kind of a cause and effect thing here. Basically, Lincoln's elected president. The Deep South secedes and starts the Confederate States of America. Now, Fort Sumter is attacked. Lincoln then calls for troops. And then after that, 4 more states secede and join the Confederacy. So with that, and Lincoln, has been criticized by some historians for making a very hasty like move there that ended up starting a war that was, much bigger than what most people thought at the time. Lincoln actually called for 75,000 troops for a term of 90 days. So he didn't expect, and this is the thing that really needs to be taken into account, that we look at, a lot of times we look at history in terms of like that people had a script or something like that. And the thing is, they didn't. Nobody saw the Civil War being a conflict of the magnitude that it ended up being. And that's where we get to all of this arguing about the causes, because when it comes down to it, the Civil War was not really entered into consciously. Like when you think about this, where we're doing things like, when psychologists talk about reacting versus responding. Did Lincoln react? Did Lincoln respond to the Fort Sumter incident, or did he react to it? And there you go. So it's very interesting there. Now, one thing to note here, Katie, is that yes, one thing that you're getting into here, Katie, Virginia, the secession of Virginia, where they had the Tredegar Iron Works, Virginia was much more industrial, like just the addition of Virginia, I think at least doubled the, I could be using some bad fractions here, maybe more than that, but I think that I'm pretty sure just the addition to that one state at least doubled the Confederate manufacturing capacity. So yeah, when it comes down to it, the Upper South, one thing that you can kind of look at here is if we go into the election of 1860. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and put this on the board here, so to speak. So let's go ahead and take a quick look at the 1860 election, and you can kind of see what we're talking about, why it's very difficult to put all of the Confederacy into one box here. So as far as that goes, we see that Virginia, Tennessee, and Kentucky, in the 1860 election, they didn't back the Southern Democratic candidate. They backed a constitutional union candidate. So there was a candidate that had support in these states. So now you see that Arkansas and North Carolina voted for the Southern Democratic candidate, but Tennessee and Virginia, you see that the majority opinion in those states was not the same as in South Carolina. It was not the same as Florida or Georgia or Alabama. So you can see that the political culture of these states is a bit different. So that's something, yeah, that we have to understand, that when you look at the Confederacy or you look at anything here, you can't look at it through just one lens. And so when you think about why did the Civil War start? What was the Civil War about? Why did the Civil War change over time? Why did soldiers on both sides fight? Well, you've got to start reading through their diaries and journals and all of that, and you see some different things come up for different people. So as far as that goes, yeah, but I think, Katie, that is a great observation there, that Virginia definitely was not. Virginia, also note here that Virginia wasn't a cotton state. Okay, so when you look at Virginia versus South Carolina, like the states that seceded initially, and see, here's where we can get into the economic reasons. Okay, so when we think about the economic reasons, what we'll see here is the sectional economic differences. We would see that the initial members, okay, so the Deep South, so the states, the states of the Deep South that formed the initial Confederacy were all cotton states. Okay, so when you look at that, it's so when we think about those 7 states that formed the Confederate States of America, they were all cotton states. Now, there were slave states, when you think about this, and that would be another thing that you would note when you say it was about states' rights, is you think about in terms of the border states. Okay, so the border states, 4 plus West Virginia. Okay, so West Virginia, slave states, were part of the Union. Okay, so Kentucky stayed in the Union, Missouri stayed in the Union, Maryland and Delaware stayed in the Union. So you see there that there were slave states that stayed in the Union. Now, if we're going for sectional economic differences, first of all, these were cotton states. So the cotton states had their own agenda. Now, then when we look at the tariffs, okay, so when we look at the more moral tariff, okay? And this is something that we go back and we think about the American system, okay? Let's think about some more, kind of go back here that the, free trade versus the American system. Remember the American system, NIP, National Bank, internal improvements, protective tariff. So when we're looking at this, like free trade versus the American system, so the 7 states, the Deep South, they were all cotton states. Now, note here that during the antebellum period, you had this fight, this constant fighting over the tariff. Okay, so when we think about this, the nullification crisis, this is something that, this is in response to the tariff of 1828. So we note here that the Southern economy, okay, the Southern economy depended on free trade. Okay, so free trade, while the Northern economy, with its, the Northern manufacturing sector specifically. Okay, so the Northern manufacturing sector, benefited from high tariffs. Okay, so we're going to note here protective tariffs. Okay, so that's what we're going to note here, that the Southern economy depended on free trade. So that is what we see here, is what was working out for the North was not working out for the South. Okay, that the South wanted an export economy, where they were trading with Europe, where they could get goods cheap from Europe. Whereas as far as what the Republicans wanted to build a national economy. Okay, so when you think about the Republicans, they didn't just want free soil. You think about this, that the Republican Party was the party that presided over most of the Gilded Age. And so when we think about that, so Republicans wanted to build, okay, so a national economy. So that's something that you want to note in terms of that. And that partly explains why that the Republican platform, the Republican Party platform, did not advocate for getting rid of slavery in the South, because slavery was really like the backbone of the American economy at that time. So that's something, when you're thinking about this, why was Abraham Lincoln a free soiler? Why were the majority of Republicans free soilers? So this is seeing like Southern secession as, as an effort to make their economy more independent. That when we think about capitalism, okay, so capitalism, was becoming more prevalent in the North, while wealth, now think about this, that I've got, okay, so for example, I've got an online business, I'm here, contracting with the Bill of Rights Institute. I provide online tutoring. I make YouTube videos. That I'm able to do things without owning a lot of land. I'm not a landowner. And so when you think about this, that capitalism has to do with money and investment. So for me, capital is not land. Capital is a computer, editing software, lights and cameras and stuff like that. Action. I want to say action now because I said lights and cameras, right? So here's the thing. Capitalism was becoming more prevalent in the North, while wealth, while land, land and human property were the basis of wealth in the South. Okay, so some people have called the Southern economy, as pre-capitalist. Okay, so so we see here that the Southern economy, has been referred to. Let's see, 2 R's. I did 1 T and then now 2 R's. Okay, referred to as pre-capitalist. Because, there are certainly capitalist elements, okay? And this is, I would specifically note Eugene Genovese. Okay, so Eugene Genovese, who was a late 20th century, mid to late 20th century historian of the antebellum South. Okay, so that's when you're looking at that, you see that there is a different sort of economy there. And so you've got two types of economies that are working together here. Now, the moral tariff, okay, so when we look at the moral tariff, this is something that was passed in, now look here, adopted March 2nd, 1861. This is one of the strongest, supports for the economic argument, because when you think about this, March 2nd, 1861. So this is something actually that was passed during before James Buchanan left office, but it seems very convenient, doesn't it? Right after the Deep South seceded. And so this is something that it replaced the low tariff of 1857. And it said here it was possible, let's see, in order to produce a clear division, it was supported by Democrats, Republicans, Northern merchants. Okay, so when we think about this, that basically what happened here was that the moral tariff was something that, you know, it replaced a low tariff with a higher tariff. Okay, so we see here that a high protective tariff passed in March of 1861. Okay, so as soon as the Deep South left, then there now were the votes to put this high tariff there. Okay, so when we think about, like, you know, you could go into, I don't know, you know, I'm going in here because I don't have exact numbers here, but when you look at, you know, yeah, so tariffs, like if we see here, you know, moral, let's see, so the moral tariff, let's see, I don't see anything there, but, you know, but basically, as far as that goes, this is something that the Confederates, I don't have the number here, but the Confederacy had a, you know, had a low tariff. Okay, so high tariff passed by the U.S. Congress in March of 1861. Then we've got, you know, the Confederate government had a tariff for revenue only. Now, another thing, this is something kind of obscure, but it's something I was reading about not too long ago. So before Lincoln decided, this is just something that's really interesting. Before Lincoln, you know, decided, when Lincoln was trying to, let me just type it. Okay, so when Lincoln was debating, you know, Lincoln and his cabinet, okay, so this idea. All right, thank y'all for letting me type for just a second. Okay, so I'll just tell the little story here. So Lincoln and his cabinet, when they were debating like whether to hold Fort Sumter, there was a debate. Well, could we just put a ship outside the harbor to collect tariffs for the United States? And when they decided that this was not going to work, then they decided, okay, like the Lincoln administration, like, okay, we're going to try to hold Fort Sumter. So the thing is that there are a lot, even though that's not something that we're seeing a lot of lately. Again, the states' rights and economic arguments are things that we're not, you know, seeing a lot of right now in economic circles, but I mean, in professional circles. But note that professional history right now is driven largely by trends toward social history. So you can see where slavery would be seen as the, you know, as the primary cause. Now, also, again, the slavery cause is much more action-packed. I'm wondering if any of y'all, when I'm going into economic differences and states' rights, it's not as engaging, is it? It's almost it's a, you know, it's a sleeper in comparison to, like, you know, all of these things when you start looking at bleeding Kansas with John Brown and like the Brooks Sumter thing and all of that. The slavery stuff is definitely the most attention getting and glamorous. Now, one thing I would note as well is, we would think in terms of, if you want like a global perspective, would be when we think about nationalism, okay? And nationalism was a global trend. And so you think about like secession, secession as a form of, regional Southern nationalism, and then Lincoln's, defense, Lincoln's determination to preserve the Union was, a form of, American, like was his own nationalism, was more of a nationalism. Okay. Now, and that's the thing too, that when Lincoln got into the Constitution, Lincoln saw the Constitution through the lens of nationalism. Now, note here the Gettysburg Address. Okay. Now, when we think about this, we can certainly read Lincoln's, Lincoln's fight against slavery into this, but more than anything else, when you look at the Gettysburg Address, you can definitely see where Lincoln is talking about the nation, okay? The nation. He talks about the nation, which this is something that we want to keep in mind, that before the Civil War, the United States was not a nation. People would say the United States were. So when we think about like slavery and states' rights, okay, when we think about the effects, we could think about the 13th Amendment. And then, but for states' rights, we could think about the 14th Amendment. So when you think about this, the 13th Amendment abolished slavery, while the 14th Amendment expanded federal power over the states. It was the first amendment to the Constitution that really went in and said, hey, I mean, the Bill of Rights was about protecting the states. Remember, protecting the states from the federal government. So when you look at that, when you look at the results, you see that the Civil War did two things, okay? That it abolished slavery, this debate over slavery, it's done. Now, the other debate was this debate about the federal government and the states. What is the relationship between the federal government and the states? Who has sovereignty? Secession's not in the Constitution. Does a state have the right to do that? Now, the Constitution's never really been updated in the text, but the Civil War did settle that issue. So the thing is, what you have to do, if you get into a DBQ, you have to get into all of these different causes, and you've got to think in terms of what is the most important cause here, okay? What am I thinking about the important cause, the most important causes? Now, gosh, the chat really, really died down a little bit. Anybody got some last words or anything there? So just, looks like y'all, hopefully y'all are still having fun over there. I just want to make sure that if there are any last minute questions, that I am here to answer those. Okay, so let me just go ahead and just hang out for just a second in terms of that, and get that going. Now, as far as that goes, on April 16th, that's Thursday, we've got our next prep webinar where we'll be looking at the constitutional amendments in context. So this is a good segue, because the 13th and 14th Amendment, those are two Reconstruction amendments. Okay, so we will look at the Bill of Rights, the Reconstruction amendments, the Progressive amendments, and the amendments having to do with the Great Depression and World War II. Okay, so as far as that goes, people are all good. I'm glad that you think. Now, the DBQ topic, Emily, I'm not going to go in with to what the DBQ topic will be, but what I will say is that I'm going to wager that it's not going to be the 20th century. Okay, so I'm going to know it's not going to be in the 20th century, my guess, because we've had two early 20th century prompts in the past 2 years. And if it's on the 20s, the Depression or World War II, all classes didn't get there before we left for Corona. So I think that people would be very upset if there was something on the DBQ that not everybody got to. So what I'm guessing is it's somewhere between the French and Indian War and the Gilded Age. I'm thinking a lot of people are placing it maybe in the early 19th century, like antebellum sectionalism or Jackson. I will be doing some crowdcast. Addie, let me close with this, okay? Is there one more important cause above all others? And this is something that I think is so important, that when we're teaching history, we need to teach history, not indoctrination. Okay, that when it comes down to it, Addie, this is what you would do working as a historian, that I've gone through here and I've given you a lot to think about. I've given you a lot of stuff here when we think about here's what we would do here for the slavery cause. Now, of course, we see, we can even, we can make some other things there, when we think about, bleeding Kansas, okay? We think about bleeding Kansas, Dred Scott, all of that's going on there. That, you look at the slavery thing. Now, note here that we're looking at an underlying cause, states' right, and a social cause. States' rights, we're looking at something more immediate and something political. We're also thinking about continuity and change over time, that what we're using here is largely like the early years of the war. Sectional economic differences, this is not as glamorous as those other causes. These two get more talk than anything else. Slavery and states' rights get more talk than anything else. But when we think about this, sectional economic differences, there's a lot here. Now, again, with the moral tariff, I'm also going to note the Pacific Railway Act. Okay, the Pacific Railway Act and the Homestead Act. Okay, so these are all things that were like pet projects of the Republican Party. So you can definitely see that there are some things here that are happening right after the South secedes from the Union. So then Westward, some of these here, are appropriate explanations as well. So what I want to encourage y'all to do, and this is the thing, is as your teacher, it's not my job to say that this cause was the most important. I've got my own views on these things, but what's important is that you're considering all the evidence and you are making a judgment for yourself. And the more that you've read about these things, the more equipped you are to make a judgment. So don't just when you're thinking about making a judgment, don't make an emotional judgment just from looking at the bulleted list. Go read about some of this stuff. Let this broadcast be a platform for discussion. That's what I would encourage you to do. And with that, thank y'all so much for joining us tonight. And remember, we're going to be back at 6:30. If you're not already subscribed to the Bill of Rights Institute, let's make sure and hit that subscribe button, because I'm going to be back on Thursday, and then I'll be back next week as well. It is always a pleasure.